Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Sudbury.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleagues for that great introduction and a great round of applause. I also need to inform you, Mr. Speaker, that I'll be splitting my time with the fantastic member from Esquimalt-Wanda-Fuca. So looking forward to that after my speech is done too, Mr. Speaker. I think the important thing to talk about in this budget is it reminds me of one of my favorite television shows from the mid-'90s to the end of the '90s, and that was the Seinfeld Show. And the Seinfeld Show was a show about nothing, right? It was a show about lots of blunder and lots of talk, but really about nothing, which is the same thing that we've seen from this budget. Mr. Speaker, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot there. It's really coming down to choices and priorities, and Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we think their choices and priorities are wrong. Are there a few good things there in the budget? Of course there are. There are some things that we've been calling for, like the rural and northern broadband. Broadband. That's actually a Freudian slip there, isn't it? Broadband. The importance of broadband for northern and rural communities is something that we've been calling for all along, especially when we've been seeing the failing of the spectrum auction that this government has been putting out over the last year. We need broadband to grow our economy in the north, Mr. Speaker, and especially in northern cities and in rural communities. But again, if you look at that, if you look at what they did when it comes to the food inspectors, we have in the budget 200 new food inspectors. Fantastic. That's great. But why is it that we get 200 new food inspectors when they cut 300? That we've had to go through the biggest meat recall crisis in our country's history. We've had the listeriosis meat recall. It just keeps showing, Mr. Speaker, that when they cut and cut and cut and then make this announcement that, hey, we're putting 200 in, it's just falsehoods, Mr. Speaker. But when we're talking about nothing, we're talking about a do-nothing budget, Northern Ontario, the great city that I represent, Sudbury, Thunder Bay, Rainy River, all of the great communities that I could think of in Northern Ontario are not mentioned in this budget. The two words don't come together. My honourable colleague from Nipissing earlier talked about FedNor and that the status quo is good enough. Actually, Mr. Speaker, the status quo isn't good enough. When we're keeping the Ring of Fire at bay because there's a lack of leadership, that's not good enough for Northern Ontarians. We actually need this government to act, to jump on and support economic growth in Northern Ontario, but this budget, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't do it. There's also no mention of any infrastructure projects. It's like they forgot Northern Ontario existed completely. Small businesses, again, Mr. Speaker, very important. I think we on this side of the House, maybe everyone in this House will agree, small businesses are the economic drivers, are the job creators in this country, but they eliminated the small business hiring credit. The Conservatives are turning their back, Mr. Speaker, on job creation. The HCSB affects around 560,000 businesses across the country, and it generally captured companies with roughly 20 to 35 employees or less. And so the HSBC was estimated to cost around $225 million annually. So even when the Conservatives decided to include small business related measures in this budget, Mr. Speaker, it was only in vague terms. And let me quote, Mr. Speaker. For example, once again, business owners are left waiting for real action on something on this side of the House we've been fighting on a daily, weekly, monthly basis to combat what are the highest credit card processing fees in the world, Mr. Speaker. So what is in the budget? To address the high costs of fees merchants pays banks to process credit cards, the government will consult on how to best to disclose the cost of different payment methods, no further details or timelines, Mr. Speaker. While we don't have a problem with such a disclosure, the NDP is calling for stronger measures to address uncompetitive practices in the market. And it's not just the NDP that's calling for this, Mr. Speaker. There are groups out there that are saying action is needed now. The Canadian Food and Restaurant Association, for example, said, why do we need to talk about this again? Why do the Conservatives need to consult to talk about an issue that that organization and many others have been talking about for years? Every time that we see the interchange rate, these swipe fees go up, It not only affects small business owners, it affects every single Canadian, Mr. Speaker. Every single Canadian has their price of whatever product they're buying goes up, Mr. Speaker, because the credit card companies continue to increase these rates. When they increase these rates, small business owners have two choices: eat the cost, and then, unfortunately, may have to go close their doors. None of us want to see that. Stop accepting credit cards. In this day and age, really, credit cards are a public utility almost. Or increase their costs, or increase the price of the product to offset the cost that's being paid. We can have action now on this, Mr. Speaker. My Lord, we waited until July of 2013 to hear from the Competition Tribunal to act on many of these anti-competitive practices that have been implemented by the credit card companies and the banks. The Competition Tribunal then ruled that they can't make the decision. It's a political decision that needs to come back to Parliament. So since July, Mr. Speaker, since July, we were waiting for action. And what we get from this government is more consultation. That relates right back to this do-nothing budget. It's wait till next year when we actually will have a surplus. But if you actually look at the numbers, and even the Minister of Finance said that, we could have been in a surplus this year, then they'll act. But now Canadian businesses, Canadian families have to wait another year before we see any action on this and many other things that would actually save Canadians' pocketbooks, making life more affordable right now for Canadians. One of my other Conservative colleagues mentioned in his speech that, you know what, we need to ensure that consumers have a balanced budget at home. Right now, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are having skyrocketing household debt. And we could have made action. We could have did action right now, Mr. Speaker, on many things that could have helped consumers right now, could have helped Canadians right now. Cap ATM fees. That's one. We had that debate here last week, Mr. Speaker. That keeps more money in the pockets of Canadian consumers. That doesn't address the household debt, Mr. Speaker, but what it does is it's a small piece in an overall puzzle to ensure that we're keeping money in the pockets of Canadians. That's one example. What about ending the pay-to-pay program that we're seeing from many of the large institutions? That's on page, I believe, 186 of the budget. But it only seems to be going after the banks on this one. That's great. But what about all of the other ones? We need to have some more details on that to ensure that we're not gouging our low income and our seniors, who are mostly the ones that are affected by a pay-to-pay program. And the pay-to-pay program, Mr. Speaker, is very simple. If you receive a paper bill, you are now being charged by some of these organizations $2 to receive this paper bill. But if you actually think about it, you're like, well, it's only $2. But if you start adding up, if that's 10, 15 bills per month, and you times that over 12 months, that gets up to a couple of $100. For seniors, that's rent. For seniors, that's food on the table, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot more that we could do to address those type of issues. Mr. Speaker, there are many things that we could have done with this budget. If they would have actually listened to some of our ideas and taken some of our ideas, we could have truly helped Canadians now. One of them that I'm hearing, one of the issues that I'm hearing quite often right now, Mr. Speaker, in my riding relates to veterans. The veterans in my riding and just individuals, the great citizens of Sudbury, are actually appalled at what happened to veterans over the last few weeks. When we're seeing their offices close, Mr. Speaker, here was an opportunity for us to act on making a difference in the lives of our veterans. Keeping these offices open would have been paramount for so many of them. And from the citizens that I'm hearing from in my riding, they were appalled at the closure that happened and would have liked to see this budget act on that. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, choices and priorities of this government really didn't look at veterans. So if you're looking at small businesses, consumers, veterans, Mr. Speaker, the priorities and choices of this government are wrong, and by 2015, hopefully, this government will be like a Seinfeld episode, a lot of reruns. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaires. The honourable member for Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I was listening intently to our colleague across the way there, and of course we know that we won't follow any kind of financial advice or budgetary advice from that party. But I'd also like to put on the record, Mr. Speaker, he talked about our veterans, and he doesn't fail. He fails to mention, in fact, Mr. Speaker, that we have put more than $5 billion since 2006 towards veterans. He talked about the closing of the VAC offices, Mr. Speaker, but he didn't bother to mention that we have added another 600 points of entry, and in those 5 out of the 8 offices, Mr. Speaker, the VAC employee will still be in the same building in the HRSDC. And we also know, Mr. Speaker, that in fact his group of PSAC members were the ones who created this terrible misunderstanding, and I would like to ask him to correct the facts, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
The honourable member for Sudbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So first off, blame the unions for everything, which is their side, what they do, which is just ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. But let me clear up some of the facts. I had a veteran in my riding who went to one of their 600 points of light. Almost seems like it's a George Bush statement when they use that. He went, got in line at Service Canada. They couldn't pull the file because they didn't know how to get his file. And then, Mr. Speaker, they give him a 1-800 number to go home to call to tell him to go back to Service Canada. On this side of the House, we respect our veterans. We want to ensure that our veterans who fought for us, who gave us the right to stand here and to debate, get the service that they need, and when they can get it, on time, not to go through a whole rigmarole that this government is actually putting our veterans through. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to touch on the veterans issue, because I do think one of the clear responsibilities of a federal government is to bring in policies for in the interest of all Canadians, and this one is anything but. It's very selective in terms of what it does. But also the responsibility of a government is to redress some of the concerns that they may have in fact created. And one of them certainly is the closure of a Veterans Services Office. I'll relate my example, where a person went to Service Canada not to get service as a veteran, but to get a passport, waited 40 minutes. Now, how do you think a veteran who has some serious problems standing in a line at veterans at Services Canada is going to feel? Is it going to help him? And I wonder if the member could maybe expand on that a little more, and what the government's real responsibility is in the interest of all Canadians, distant in this budget.
Member for Sudbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question. And I think, Mr. Speaker, it relates to how I talked about its choices and priorities. And I don't think the choices and the priorities that this government has made is actually helping. Right? When we're talking about veterans, opening these offices again is a choice that they could have made. After hearing from veterans from coast to coast to coast, the veterans were asking for these offices to open again. The government made the choice not to, and instead saying, you know what, we're going to send them to all of the Service Canada offices. The Service Canada offices provide great service. There are great people who are doing great work there. But the needs of the veterans are different. The needs of our veterans might be specific, so specific that you need that counsellor there to provide that service. But it comes down again, Mr. Speaker, to choices and priorities. Canadians, when it comes to being consumers, when it comes to small businesses, when it comes to our youth and our youth unemployed, my colleague also mentioned, what about the other 250-some thousand unemployed youth in this country? The choice that this government made wasn't to support them. On this side of the House, we want to ensure that we support our youth, we support our unions, we support our veterans, and we support the great work that is being done by all of my colleagues on this side of the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate.